Hello, everyone. I'm Kelly Covert, and I am so pleased to be here today with two Peters, Peter Rovit, our concertmaster, and Peter Rabinowitz, our program notes annotator. And they are both going to share with you about our upcoming concert, Baroque Brilliance. So if you're unsure if you love Baroque music, sit back and enjoy because they are going to explain the ins and outs, and you are going to be thrilled about what's coming ahead. So, Peter Rovit, why don't you take it away?
Well, hi everybody. I'm really excited about our concert that we're giving. The repertoire is has uh, some pieces by some composers that I'm sure you all have heard of, and then some other music by composers I'm sure you've never heard of. It. It's all really good stuff. It's all a lot of fun. There was easily, three times more things that I would have loved to put on the program, but I picked a little selection of different things that I thought were that would everybody would enjoy that I love.
Okay, actually, it's interesting. Some of this stuff is so familiar, or some of the composers are so familiar. And as you say, some are so unfamiliar. There are certainly people on this program that I had never heard of before either. You know, but let's get into this. The last time I heard you play was a fabulous performance of the Franck Sonata at the Syracuse Friends of Chamber Music about a week ago. And the Franck Sonata is sort of the essence of the romantic uh, violin sonatas, I would say. And moving from that to the Baroque must be a big jump. And you want to talk a little bit about what's different between playing romantic music and playing Baroque music?
Yeah, Peter, it's a really excellent question, and it's something that I think maybe even some professional musicians maybe not quite so clear on because I think when I was a student studying music, and I didn't necessarily feel this way, but when I was a student and studying music, oftentimes you felt like there were people who would describe Baroque music as as like playing it properly meant what you couldn't do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you couldn't do slides, you can't do vibrato, you can't do this, you can't as if it's a kind of music making where you're restricted. If you're trying to do it correctly, you're restricted, and it's really not the case at all. And sort of getting into that difference between style for Baroque and even classical music and romantic music is something that I've really enjoyed exploring over my time with the instrument. Um, I would say that with music like Franck, romantic music, um, there's a form of romantic expression that involves um, obviously the vibrato is the thing that you might notice the most. The vibrato is very sustained and maintained through from one note into the next note, and also the sound, the quality of the sound is sustained through one note into the next note. So there's a quality with which you're using sustained sound to create really long lines, um, and I think that's the one of the characteristics of romantic playing that's not necessarily a big part of Baroque playing. And for me, one of the things that I've loved exploring on the violin is the difference between playing romantically and playing expressively. And
Mm-hmm.
when we play Mozart and when we play Bach and any of this other Baroque stuff, we can play very expressively without playing romantically. And it involves shaping with the bow more. And it doesn't mean we're not allowed to vibrate. It just means vibrato is not quite as much of a front and center part of our expressive toolbox. It's one of several.
You know what you said before about the learning Baroque when you did and learning it as a kind of set of restrictions rather
Yeah.
than a set of expressions. Certainly, Baroque performance has changed an awful lot.
Hmm.
And it used to be back in the day, when orchestras like, the Boston Symphony or particularly the Philadelphia Orchestra touched on Baroque music, it was, again, extremely romantic. Then we came the thing the way you were taught, which was sort of trying to differentiate Baroque and romantic. Well, what is it like now, and how do you play as a 21st century Baroque violinist with a modern orchestra, which is not a period instrument orchestra?
Mhm. Well, it's tricky. It's a balancing act.
Yeah,
I do have a
that's
Baroque
why I
violin.
asked the question. I knew it was
Yeah,
tricky.
I do have a Baroque violin and a Baroque bow, um, and playing with a Baroque period, like a bow that is made to the specifications of those Baroque bows. It is very different. It's a, it's not capable of as much volume, but the way I would look at it is those Baroque bows is sort of like the equivalent, the difference between, let's say, driving like like driving an SUV, that would be the modern bow, or driving like a little sporty two-seater, and that's the Baroque bow.
Well,
It's
that makes
like
it sound like a lot more exciting, doesn't it?
it's so you can't. It doesn't have as much of that sustain that we were talking about. It's shorter, it's lighter, and the fact that it's lighter means you can do a lot of like fancy, quick stuff that's actually harder to do with a modern bow that's a bit longer, a bit heavier. A modern bow is designed to be that you can sustain it and play longer bows. So I'm not using my Baroque bow for this concert because it would be challenged in terms of volume comparing with the rest of the ensemble, and we can't buy Baroque bows for everyone in the ensemble, and then on top of that, it would be getting used to the different balance and how to use them. But I try, when I play Baroque music, I try to be informed by the style that kind of bow encourages, and it is really, it does make you very capable of doing really fast kind of fancy footwork kind of things, like fast zippy little bowing patterns, and you can sort of toss them off with more speed in your bow than a modern bow would allow. And that's kind of what one of the things that gives that energy, I think, to period performances that we like so much. That there's a combination of like very clear, crisp articulation and sort of a dance-like quality, sort of speed in the bow, uh, and yeah, it's always a lot of fun to look into. And yeah, I mean, let me know if I haven't quite answered your question.
Well, no, you have answered my question and opened up a whole bunch of new questions. So one of the things you talk about the fancy quick stuff, and this is called Baroque Brilliance. And
Mhm.
I do know for some people, Baroque music is kind of staid and formal. And you had even mentioned that as sort of behind some of the teaching before proper. And actually, the Baroque is like a time of great extravagance and everything else. Could you talk a little bit about the way lines are decorated,
Yeah.
figurations, all that stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think of a lot of this, some of the Baroque tradition that came down to us. It's sort of a holdover of those romantic musicians like Mendelssohn, who rediscovered the music of Bach, you know,
Right.
and these composers sort of rediscovered this music of Bach, this very cerebral and beautiful, wonderful, complex, music, and and um, and I think maybe that aesthetic of that this is a very serious, sober, complex thing, and Bach is that, and among other things. But
Yeah.
also in a lot of this early Italian, especially Italian Baroque music, there's an incredible amount of exuberance and experimentation, and of course, and Baroque music at that time shares a lot in common with jazz, where there was like a certain basic tune, and then the performers were not just allowed to, but were expected to sort of improvise off of those basic tunes. And that was part of that Italian Baroque tradition. There was another tradition at the time, which was the French Baroque tradition, which was a little bit more staid, a little bit more refined, a little bit less. You can't throw everything in but the kitchen sink. You can do a few little ornaments here and there, but they must be tasteful, and they mustn't obscure the basique melody. And there were those two camps, sort of two tribes in Baroque times, of like who prefers the Italian style, which is this exuberant, over the top, virtuosic, and who prefers the French style that's balanced and tasteful. And You know, and you know, both, I mean, both elements of style have things that endured, but basically, somebody named Arcangelo Corelli came along, and you know, apparently toured around Europe and just bowled everybody over with his violin playing and his virtuosity for the time, and also came out in 1700, came out with a book of sonatas, 12 sonatas for violin and basso continuo, that was literally like a bestseller, was republished all over Europe, and just became an incredible, like the most popular. He became a rock star, and you know, with that in the early 1700s, and everybody was scrambling to write sonatas in his style or imitate his playing, and so in that way, the Italian style kind of started to win out in the hearts and minds of music lovers.
Even getting to England through Handel, right?
Through Handel, and one of the composers we're going to be playing, Nicola Mateus, also made his way to London, and was a contemporary account. Somebody mentions, you know, a lot of these guys, we don't have a lot of biographical information on them, but you know, a contemporary observer said that he was second only to Corelli in the beauty of his playing and the sweetness of his sound and whatnot.
Well, so you want to tell us a little bit about what are the most exciting things that people should look forward to here? I mean, I've been through all these pieces in preparing for this concert. I haven't heard your performances yet, but they're all in their individual ways pretty dramatic and exciting. What can people expect?
Well, you know, one of the forms that I love in Baroque music and actually in music in general is the whole repeated bass line idea. And you know, it has different names depending on who you ask. It's some people call it a chaconne, some people call it a passacaglia. That's also what else? Purcell, Henry Purcell calls it a ground or a ground bass. And these are all things where you find a catchy bass line tune and you repeat it over and over and over again. And then however many solo instruments you have, play a sort of flights of fancy on top of this repeating bass line. And then there's also a harmony instrument filling in, you know, filling in harmonies. And it's a form that I love, and I think composers really enjoyed writing music like that. I think it kind of, you know, when you have that, it's a combination of, you have this very kind of rigid structure, and then on top of that somewhat rigid structure, it allows you a lot of freedom, you know. And I think that's the case in a lot of art forms. You know, structure create freedom. It doesn't, you know, rather than constraining it. And so I love those chaconnes and the Purcell three parts upon a ground. Just the luxuriance of the sound and the harmonies, and you know, the ornamentation. I mean, you know, people wouldn't necessarily know what's written and what's ornamented, but you would know if you heard the piece more than once and you hear different stuff, you know, different things, different times. And you know, that idea of a repeating bass line, I mean, that comes all the way up to today. And you know, some of our, you know, rock and roll tunes that we love. It's the same idea.
Yeah, and it was very, very important for Britten and Shostakovich. It is actually my favorite musical form too. It's interesting that you say what you do, because, and there is something about the sense of inevitability combined with the sense of you don't know what's going to happen, that I find really fascinating, and I think the modern composers did that too. What about the other pieces? Because one of the other things that's special about the Baroque is its interest in concerto grosso, which is concertos for a group of instruments rather than the 19th century, which sort of solidified the idea of a single soloist fighting against the orchestra. The Baroque's quite different most of the time, not all the time.
Yeah, well, the Baroque was the Baroque time was when we had this thing called the concerto grosso, which is kind of a hybrid between a symphony and a concerto. You know, and so, you know, later on they both branched off, and we had just concertos and just symphonies. But at the time, it was always a combo. So you had oftentimes two solo violins, and then the rest of the orchestra. And also in these pieces, also we have some solo cello as well. So you have like this three solo voices, and then you have the orchestra, and there's a bit of alternation. In the Handel, there's a bit of alternation between them, where sometimes the soloists are playing together with everyone else, and sometimes the soloists are playing their own solo lines. In the Wassenauer, I think this, for the most part, the soloists are playing their own lines all the time. So it's pretty much like a double concerto, even though it's and it is called a concerto.
So one other thing that's a little bit different here is that normally at a Symphoria concert, except during our COVID season when we've tried everything else and there's been a lot of chamber music, but normally on a orchestra concert, Larry is up there and there's the conductor doing his job, and then the soloists are over there. In this concert, you are going to be simultaneously conducting and playing the violin. How do you do that?
Well, I mean, one of the things that we can do a little bit when we play violin is we have our scroll sticking out, and we can kind of I mean, we don't do the conducting pattern, but we can kind of direct a little bit that way, and throughout history, especially at that time, there were no conductors,
Right.
And different groups found different solutions. So sometimes, this is vague in my memory, but I think I remember that it may have been Haydn who would sometimes, for his symphonies, would play along on the pianoforte or the harp, the pianoforte, and maybe do a little bit of directing from the pianoforte in playing in his symphonies, or and then often the concertmaster of the orchestra would also sort of direct the ensemble that way. So I mean, throughout history, that was kind of how orchestras, how they did it. And it was only in the time of Beethoven that and actually we know exactly who the first person was. It was a concertmaster, one of the big German orchestras, I forget which, Ludwig Spohr, who put down his violin one day and stood in front of his group with a stick and said, I'm gonna conduct you guys out, because he was a good musician, and he was realizing that music was getting to a certain degree of complexity now, that there just needed to be one person with both hands free who could sort of direct and keep everything together, because of course there we're getting into the symphonies of Beethoven, and and there it's hard to
Right.
it's hard to just be conducting with bouncing your scroll up and down, at that point.
Just as a sort of aside, but also a bit of an advertisement for another concert, the Ludwig Spohr is also famous as a composer as well as a conductor, and he wrote a very famous nonet, which was the model for the Louise Farrenc nonet, which we are also playing. Mm-hmm. So all of these things do get connected. So part of what's going on there, though, in terms of your ability to conduct this group, has something to do with the fact that these are players that you've worked with intimately for years and years and years, that you know them and they know you, mm-hmm. Right? And this is really sort of, as you say, in between the concerto and the symphony. This is also in between chamber music and orchestral music, what we are
absolutely, yes.
today.
Yeah. And there's also a certain degree to which we're talking about, Baroque music as sort of as a little bit sort of the jazz element, and in a group like that, and it's also similar to chamber music. Certain people will maybe take the lead at certain points, maybe not with physical motioning, but maybe just with their sound, and the way that they're playing might sort of like come to the foreground and take charge, depending on what's happening with the music.
Well, Peter and Peter, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I went to music school, and I feel like I learned things today that I did not know about Baroque music. So I really appreciate this insight. And I think that everyone is really going to enjoy the Baroque Brilliance concert, which is part of our casual series. It will be streamed from Inspiration Hall on Sunday, February 28th. The concert. So thanks to both of you, and we'll see you at the concert hall.
Thank you.